Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our SharePoint 2019 webinar, What You Need to Know. My name is Rick Setti. So you see my photo on the screen there. I'm on this side of the screen. I'm one of the client advisors in PA's Workplace Innovation team. I'll be your co-host with my colleague, Paul Bamra, for this webinar. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping things. So you'll have a section at the bottom of your screen where you can ask your questions, and we'll get to them towards the end of the webinar. And we also will be recording this session, so in case you miss out on anything, you'll have an opportunity to go through it once you get the link to a recording on our YouTube page. All right, so let's just have a quick look at the agenda for today. So I'll take you through a high-level SharePoint timeline to give you an overview of how things started and how it's come along over the years. We'll be talking about this SharePoint 2019, what's new in this version of SharePoint. Obviously, that's the core focus of the webinar today. We'll talk about when does an on-premises SharePoint environment become a preferred option. And then at the end, we'll have options of upgrading and migrating to SharePoint, and we'll finish off with the Q&A session. But before we get stuck into that, I would like to get a bit of understanding of your current scenarios. We'll start off with a quick poll. So you'll get a poll on your screen. Can you please select the option which suits, which reflects your scenario the most? Have you got a SharePoint 2013 environment or older, 2016, 2019, or is it SharePoint Online within a hybrid setup? So if you can select the option, we'll give you 30 seconds, and then I'll get started. You can see some answers coming in, so that's great. Fantastic. Okay, so it looks like the majority of the attendees today have, actually the majority have a SharePoint Online. That's quite interesting. And the second most is 2013 or older. So wonderful. I will start off with the SharePoint timeline to give you an overview of how things started. So basically, the SharePoint journey started back in 2001, almost 18 years ago. It was called SharePoint Portal Server, which was then followed by a version in 2003, 2007. And 2010 is when we realized, we saw most businesses taking this as their content management solution and intranet and so forth. That's where we saw a big change in adoption from businesses for this platform. There's a big change at the time in 2010 because Microsoft enabled multi-browser support and introduced social networking features, which was then followed by a version in 2013, which is when we saw OneDrive for Business got introduced with SharePoint 2013 Server. And then another big change came in 2016. Now, since 2010, we've also seen BPOS, which is a previous version known as Office 365. And in 2016, there was a huge focus on hybrid setups. So that version was built from ground up from users' perspective, the interface would work seamlessly with Office 365 and SharePoint on premises. And what we have today is the SharePoint 2019 version, which is what the focus for today's webinar is. And Microsoft has modernized a lot of stuff in this new version. The interface, a lot of functionality has been modernized, and that's what we'll be talking about today. With that, I'll hand you over to my colleague, Paul Bamra. So Paul's one of our senior SharePoint consultants. He's got over 8 years of experience delivering different SharePoint solutions, has worked with a number of different organizations, big and small. He's quite passionate about technology. One thing his clients like about it is that he's technology agnostic, even though he's focused on SharePoint, but he's quite clear about what SharePoint's capabilities are, and he's upfront about it. So he'll now take you through the SharePoint 2019 version. Welcome, Paul. Over to you.
Thanks for that, Rick. So we'll start off with the question, why do we want to use SharePoint on premises? So we'll talk about a couple of the most common reasons based on our experience. So as Rick mentioned, we work with different types of organization, and there's a lot of different reasons why someone would use on-premises versus going to the cloud. The first reason we'll talk about is compliance, and probably what you're more familiar with is the concept of data residency. So the reality is that most legislation is actually catching up with the ever-evolving cloud landscape. So we have a lot of cloud services, and a lot of them now are even hosted in the country. However, many industries have even more strict compliance requirements. For example, a common requirement that we see is obviously to store the data in Australia. But the reason for that is so it can be better governed by the Privacy Act. And more recently, we also have the notifiable data breach scheme. So in order to be fully governed by Australian laws, it's really just easier to make sure that all our content is in the country. And we have other requirements like being able to access data centers. So certain industries have that requirement. So that's one of the key things we see as a driver for staying on premises. Internet connectivity. So this is actually one of the big reasons that we would in fact stay on premises. We typically take internet connectivity for granted. But if your business has a lot of remote sites, even if you've got a lot of branch offices, we can't always take for granted that the connectivity speed or even connectivity at all is going to exist. So for example, I just recently designed a SharePoint 2019 farm that takes advantage both of cloud. So we're leveraging SharePoint Online to make the infrastructure costs a lot cheaper, but we actually integrate and leverage the hybrid features so that we can have, in reality, 2 on-premises farms. So one in the head office in Melbourne, and that's where we actually have the capability to do things like index file shares so that we have both content in the cloud and on premises. And where the exciting part comes in is we have a secondary farm that's actually off the coast of Australia on an island. And in this scenario, what we actually get is we have hybrid, but we actually have the capability to be offline for not only a couple of hours, but say weeks at a time, where the users have access to the key data on their local farm, so they don't need anything except a local area network. So that's one of the key sort of uses of on-premises SharePoint, and 2019 just makes that a lot easier. It was a lot harder in older versions, like for example 2013, which a lot of you are currently using. And while this may seem like an extreme scenario, even just think about if you're a part of a multinational, when's the last time you needed to maybe download a file from maybe your UK office or a US field office? Just that latency and being able to work on that file, connectivity is there, but the fact that it's a remote site, that latency just makes it really hard to work on files. So that's what we see as a common use case to actually leverage on-premises SharePoint. And finally, heavy customization. So while the general trend has been to try to reduce customization for SharePoint, and we definitely agree when it comes to things like document management or just say an intranet, but the reality is SharePoint can be used very effectively as a presentation layer to simplify a user's workflow. Sounds a little bit complicated, but the reality is we want users to log into one site, and whether that's integrating with, say, an invoicing process that can be kicked off from your intranet's homepage, or alternatively, have the steps required for a staff onboarding, employee onboarding process to be baked into our SharePoint intranet, are pretty common and really powerful use cases. So that's where on-premises come in, because we just have more options for customizations. So those are the common reasons. And I spoke a little bit about the cloud and SharePoint Online. We sort of see a lot of overlap. The reality, though, is that the overlap is getting larger and larger. So as Rick mentioned, we're getting the ability to use modern on SharePoint 2019, and we're getting more capabilities provided in the on-premises version, so that the overlap is getting greater and greater. And the reality is most of our clients and most of the projects we work in are using hybrid to leverage the strengths of both. So rather than just picking one, why not use both? And so based on that, now we'll talk a little bit about what's new in SharePoint 2019. Firstly, we'll look at what's new for admins. So it may not sound exciting, but we've actually got more modern integration with IIS. So the underlying framework that hosts our SharePoint environment running on Windows Server now is actually no longer using IIS 6 dependencies and is actually able to leverage IIS 7 and onwards. And what this basically means is that as newer versions of Windows Server and IIS become available, SharePoint's able to tap into those new features. And what it also means is that we know for a fact that older versions of Windows aren't going to be supported forever. So currently, a lot of the clients that we're working with are upgrading their Windows Server 2008 environments. By leveraging newer IIS, it means that we're actually able to upgrade our Windows Server architecture as well. So we don't have to rely on older versions of Windows. Next, we have SMTP authentication. So simply put, we've always been able to send emails from SharePoint, and it's a feature users have just really taken for granted. On the back end, though, the way this actually occurred is we would have to do things like set up anonymous relays. So SharePoint was allowed to access our Exchange servers and send out emails without any sort of authentication. The best we got was whitelisting IP addresses and that sort of thing. But now we actually have the ability to use credentials. So now not only are we still able to send out emails, but we're able to do so in highly secure environments. So where we have policies where we're not allowed to use anonymous relays, we can actually use SharePoint 2019 now. And so that's a pretty powerful sort of new capability. And next we've got improved PowerShell. So PowerShell's pretty much been the standard for quite a number of years for, at the very least, managing Microsoft server applications like Windows, Exchange, and obviously SharePoint. But now we've actually got even more PowerShell commandlets available to us. So one of the recent additions has been new commands related to the user profile service. So if anyone's user profile service from an administration perspective, you know, in some cases it can be a bit of a nightmare to set up. There's a lot of moving parts, and now we can start automating a lot of that through PowerShell so that we don't have to use the user interface. So that makes it a lot easier to manage servers, especially when we start getting to multi-server environments. Next, we've got an increased file size limit for an individual file uploaded to SharePoint of 15 gig. So this is pretty killer, and it's gotten to the point where we've got feature parity with SharePoint Online. SharePoint Online's had this for quite some time. Now SharePoint on premises has it as well. And it's important to keep in mind that SharePoint 2016 had a 10 gig limit, and SharePoint 2013 had a 2 gig limit. And it goes down pretty significantly from there, like 250 meg, and in some cases, older versions recommended was only 50 megs or lower. The experience just wasn't there for users. So that's a pretty important feature when it comes to just usability. Next, we've got fast site creation. So if you've ever used SharePoint on premises, you've probably experienced a new site taking easily a minute to create. Worst case scenario, you may have experienced things like timeouts for complex sites. And now in SharePoint 2019, we've actually got the most common templates optimized so that they'll only just take a few seconds to create. So this makes it a lot easier for the provisioning cycle. So we don't have to, even if we make it available to users, it takes a few seconds and they can create new sites. And really along those lines comes just the path limit. So this has been up to 400 characters, coming up from 260 characters in the last version. So what does the path limit really mean? It means that admins and also users to a lesser degree can just move across all the nested folders that we have in our file share, or maybe in our older SharePoint environments, we want to do things like consolidation. We actually have the ability to do that without spending a lot of time trying to collapse down a very deeply nested folder structure. Because we've bumped up so much from 260 characters to 400, a lot of content can just be moved across. And in a lot of cases, it's at the upper limit of the File Explorer as well. So that's a really powerful feature that we have now. Now we'll start talking about what the users sort of see. So a bit more on the front end. So one of the most anticipated features was the availability of modern interface. So this really brings it onto parity with SharePoint Online. So the first feature that we have, and we see on the screen, is just modern sites. So we have the ability to create modern team sites and communication sites. This brings a whole new user experience to SharePoint. It's been designed from the ground up to work with mobile devices and addresses dozens of usability issues. So these usability enhancements extend to lists and libraries. We can do things like format columns more easily. And think about a scenario where you may have wanted KPI indicators on a column. And the type of Excel-like conditional formatting is now possible. And what we also have is the information panel. So we see that on the screen on the right-hand side. And this is where we have a simple panel that slides in from the right-hand side where we're able to do things like filter. And the filters are really powerful because they're contextual. So we don't see the option to filter data if we can't actually filter it. So that's really powerful stuff. And that same panel is what's used to, rather than push people to another screen to edit the metadata, that same panel lets us modify metadata as well. So it makes it a lot more seamless for the user, so they're not jumping between screens, which was a common complaint with older versions of SharePoint. And now we also have a much better page authoring experience. So we have the classic experience on the left. So we see a lot of, grids. We see a lot of add web part screens, and it's a little bit clunky. So people typically got used to it. But what we see on the right-hand side is a simple UI. So we hit a plus button, we add web parts. We hit that same plus button, we can add new sections. So rather than building predefined, very tightly controlled web part zones and layouts, we leave that to the users now. So we have basically the ability to have dynamic page layouts based on what's actually required. And finally, we have a modern search experience. So the first thing that the search brings to the table is just that modern experience, and that seamless UI comes into play. But then as we type, we get our search results. So something that we see on other sites, on websites, things like autocomplete or results as we type, now that's available on premises in SharePoint 2019. And the nice part is that this actually taps into hybrid as well. So if we do actually have the ability to roll out SharePoint Online and SharePoint on premises, we can have one search experience that consolidates the results from everywhere. And so moving on from, I guess, that basic modernization of certain features, we also have some completely new features that are being brought onto SharePoint on premises. Some of you may likely be familiar with this screen if you're using Office 365, but the SharePoint homepage basically provides unified access to all your sites. Whether you're accessing content that's online or on premises, users can seamlessly navigate to their sites, access a personalized view of news, as well as view all recent activity that matters to them. In some cases, we've seen this SharePoint homepage replace a more traditional intranet homepage, where it's all about collaboration and it's all about getting access to the content that is relevant to you. And next, we actually have finally, if you've been waiting for this, have access to the next generation sync client in SharePoint 2019. So we're able to use this sync tool not only on the desktop, but on Android and iOS devices, which is really great. And one of the best features from even just a personal perspective and what our clients use is called Files on Demand. So Files on Demand basically lets us as individual users decide which files or folders are most important to us and should be always accessible. And the rest of the files are available on demand. And what that basically translates to is that in the background, all our important files are synchronizing to our laptops as we work on other files, and the files that we deem as being not as important, as soon as we double click that file, our system will go and download the latest version of it. So that's really powerful, because in the days of sort of ultrabooks, we may not have the capability to synchronize 100 gig, but we really want a 2019 to 2020 folder synchronized, because that's the active project we're working on, and that's going to keep us in sync regardless of whether we're in the office, we're using Wi-Fi or 4G. We can have it set to synchronize and keep that content available all the time. And with that new improved syncing capability, we also have more modern sharing capabilities. So here we can see we actually have the ability to start sharing files, even if they're stored in SharePoint 2019 or SharePoint Online, straight from our File Explorer. So we can just right-click on a file and say we want to share it. And the nice part is that this includes the ability to share it with our colleagues, not only inside our organization, but we have the ability to share with colleagues outside the organization as well, and all we need is an email address. So this functionality is great, and again, it expands to the mobile devices as well, works great with hybrid, so that regardless of where we're working, we have the ability to share and synchronize files. So we're never stuck in that situation of accessing an old version of a document that was emailed to us. Finally, we'll talk a little bit about the SharePoint mobile app. So we could use the SharePoint mobile app in previous versions of SharePoint on-premises and obviously SharePoint Online, but now with the modern interface, it's a more seamless experience. So now that we have modern sites and we've got modern libraries, we actually have the ability for users to log in on their phone or their iPad and access their Teams intranet site, and then when they get to their desktop, it actually looks the same. So rather than having a cut down version on the mobile device, we have the same experience. And we also have the applications like OneDrive that we saw, so we can still synchronize files on a case-by-case basis on our mobile devices as well. And I've spoken a lot about hybrid and integration. And the reality is that while it was really introduced in SharePoint 2016, it's just getting better with SharePoint 2019. So there's better hybrids. So I spoke about the ability to integrate your search, to have a unified search experience regardless of whether you're searching online or on premises. But now that is expanded with products that are cloud only. So we have Power Apps so that we can customize forms like we see on the screen. So we can actually customize the form experience within SharePoint with the use of Power Apps. And the way we're able to do that is we have the on-premises data gateway, which is installed on-premises, and it basically allows SharePoint 2019 to enable these integrations and improve user experiences with things like Power Apps, as well as Flow. So customized Power Apps forms for a SharePoint list no longer require a developer. So it's very much a what you see is what you get editor. And the associated processes can now extend beyond SharePoint workflows. So SharePoint workflows are still there, but we can now take advantage of Microsoft Flow and take advantage of well over 100 standard connectors and have integrations, whether it's to things like Twilio to send out SMS messages, or whether it's to Twitter to automate our social presence from our SharePoint environment. And we also have the ability to build custom connectors for Flow so we can integrate with your proprietary line of business applications so that you can still leverage the power of Flow as well as Power Apps for a custom UI, but you don't need to move your confidential or tightly regulated content out of your on-premises environment. So we've spoken a lot about the new and improved features in SharePoint 2019. So now it's really about thinking about what's our upgrade strategy? How do we upgrade? What do we need to think about? So at a really high level, there are two approaches that we can take when it comes to a upgrade. So firstly, we've got a database upgrade. So if we think about a database upgrade, this is where we're typically pretty happy with our structure. We may be upgrading typically from just one or two versions, but what is a requirement is that we leapfrog every version. So we need to jump between every single version. So for example, if we're upgrading from 2013, we need to firstly upgrade our database across to our 2016 environment, and then from 2016 to 2019. And if we think about older sort of versions, say you're still on MOS or SharePoint 2007, you actually need to create an environment for every single version that you want to sort of upgrade to, every version in between. Typically, it's more straightforward, and so that's really the benefit of the database upgrade strategy, is that it's more about being efficient, and it's really a lift and shift. So we're not doing any great degree of cleanup, we're just moving our content across because maybe we're getting to end of life and we want to use the new version, or alternatively, we're maybe just going from 2016 to 19, so smaller jumps. So we definitely see value in that. The other approach we have is content migration. So content migration is more about moving libraries, moving pages, moving lists across using migration tools. So Microsoft's got its own migration tool now. So we have the SharePoint migration tool, very creative naming. And basically, the SharePoint migration tool lets you move across from SharePoint 2013 onwards into, say, the cloud, and say if you wanted a hybrid. And there are other third-party tools that let you move from, say, older versions to stay on premises. And the benefit of this approach is it's more curated. So you're actually evaluating the need for certain content before you actually upgrade. So do we need this page that outlines a policy about using specific equipment, but we no longer actually own that equipment? Probably not. So this is where we're curating the content and we're moving that across, and we're better able to leverage new features. But the reality is there is no single answer. Sites with heavy customization may be simpler with a database upgrade because we've got our customizations, we're happy with how they work, and we just want to move them to the new platform because we're getting to end of life, for example. However, larger sites that require cleanup because of old and abandoned content, we may actually want to do a more controlled content migration where we pick and choose what content gets brought across and we archive the rest. And this is where someone like PA can come in, because we can help work with you to review what content you currently have and what steps you need to take to upgrade. But as you move away, you may want to think about, okay, where do I start? First step is you obviously need to have clear goals for success. And once we've identified what constitutes a success, we need to conduct an audit of what we have. What content has been used recently? What content hasn't been? What do we need to merge? Things like that. And once we've identified that content that needs to be cleaned up, we do a spring clean. And then if we're upgrading between versions, we build our multiple farms. So whether it's maybe just one farm because you're jumping between just two versions, or whether it's 3 or 4 farms that need to be built. That's something that will be a case-by-case basis discussion. Then we obviously, the one-liner, but it's a big one, we upgrade our databases or we migrate our content across using the third-party tools. And one key one we see a lot of users miss, and a lot of our clients, is that we actually need to redeploy custom solutions manually. So even if we do a database upgrade or even if we do a content migration, any sort of customizations that we've deployed may need to be redeployed if you're choosing to keep them. And lastly, we obviously just need to test this. So that's where the validation comes in, so that we can ensure that we've met our goals. So hopefully you've got a good idea of what SharePoint 2019 has brought to the table. And now I'll actually hand it over to Rick, who will run through some customer stories.
Thanks for that, Paul. I'm pretty sure the attendees would have found the content useful. And it's quite interesting to see that a lot of the attendees today are already using SharePoint Online. So maybe they're looking for a hardware sort of setup with the new version. So I'll take you through some of the projects that PA has delivered recently. As you know, SharePoint can be configured in a number of different ways. It can be a document management solution, it can be corporate intranet, it can help you build reporting from other systems, and it can help you automate processes. So the actual outcome depends on what you're trying to achieve as a business. To give you some flavors, I'll share some screenshots for the projects that I've delivered recently to give you some ideas. All right, so the first one we have is for a construction company called Mainbreast Constructions. So these guys have around 200 employees across 3 different states. So their key concern was communication and compliance. So let's have a closer look at the site there. So they main concern was emails that used to be sent to the staff. So when the project started, they actually called it war on emails. So they definitely wanted to reduce the number of emails that were sent. And the emails are regarding employee communications, the social events coming up and documentation and so forth. So what they built was the corporate intranet, which is a home page on the PC. So when the user starts in every morning, this is what they see. This is a central location for all the social events, employee benefits, employee self-services, and all the database. Now, they actually achieved a lot more than communication with this project. That helped them change the cultural shift in other parts of the business. So one of the other key achievements was it simplified their onboarding process. So before this solution was deployed, the emails would get sent by the HR team to the new starter with links on how to order a uniform, how to order stationery, how to apply for leave, and so forth. And quite often they would forget to send some specific emails, which would, make it harder for the new employee to start, to get jobs done. So with this, they built a self-service portal, which you see a link there, and they would have all the information specific to the role, which really made it easy for them to jump on the ground running, which is very important in the business, because that's the key expectation. Now, another achievement as part of this project was helping them achieving their compliance goals. So they wanted to be ISO certified, which requires them to have certain processes and documentation in place. It also a requirement for them to, as part of the bidding process, and has an impact on the type of business they're in. So SharePoint helped them achieve that. So it created a central repository of all the key documentation. Now, in their business in particular, they were looking for digital transformation because a lot of their staff is out on site and they require access to key project documentation on their mobile phones. And it was a bit of a challenge because traditionally there were different versions of documentation of drawings which would have an impact on the project and often would cause delays in delivery. So by centralizing all that information, SharePoint helped them be more efficient with projects, and which had a direct impact on the business profitability and customer experience. So, and now they actually have a name for this intranet. It's called MILA. It's a short form of Main Brace Intranet and Learning Area, and it's quite popular in the business because they often talk to each other. If you don't know anything, just go ask MILA. So it's quite interesting. The next one we have is for our NFP. So let's shift gears from a commercial organization to NFP. So these guys already had an intranet before they deployed SharePoint, but it was pretty old. Nobody liked it. It was actually managed by IT, and a lot of content in that environment was stale, so the business didn't have much faith in it. And it wasn't because they didn't want to, it was just too hard to manage it. So these guys wanted a new interface, which is what they got here. So this is a home page again. It's got employee self-services portal. It's got links to the key documents. And other thing they wanted to achieve as part of this project was improve their records management, because they were using a legacy application, which is very expensive and hard to maintain. And we delivered the solution in SharePoint, so at 1/3 of the cost. And they had a lot of manual processes in the business as well. So one of the processes which we targeted as part of this project was the recruitment process, which is paper-based. So before the solution was deployed, there would be manual papers filled in, which will move from one desk to the other, and will take a few weeks before a decision was made to hire a new person. And a lot of times, the paper will get lost on the way and cause unwanted delays. Now, the feedback we received after deploying the solution, the whole process can be done less than a week. So quite an improvement there. So this is the central location for all the information specific to the business and is audience targeted. So that's to give you some flavors on what can be achieved out of SharePoint. We'll now open the floor for any questions you may have, and we'll get to that. So we started to see some questions come in, and let's have a look.
Okay, so this is an interesting question. So with a migration strategy, are there significant losses in standard functionality, for example, to changes to InfoPath between 2013 and 2019? And how do the migration tools deal with these differences? So this is definitely something that changes case by case. So, if we look at, say, InfoPath specifically, as well as, say, farm solutions. So, InfoPath forms, for those that aren't familiar, it was a pretty common way to create custom forms. So, when we think about a onboarding process, or we think about like an expense form, so InfoPath was sort of used for that functionality. And SharePoint had basically a browser-based version of InfoPath. And so when it comes to migration tools, with that sort of example in particular, InfoPath is not part of SharePoint 2019. So from a functionality perspective, there is functionality that is lost. However, there's a couple of migration tools that do actually look for deprecated features. So one tool in particular is from an organization called Rencore, and they actually have a tool that tells you how you can remap your InfoPath form. So it also includes things like evaluating SharePoint workflows to see if they're good candidates for Microsoft Flow. And so from a InfoPath specific perspective, this is where the tool would flag that, okay, that can't be migrated, and it would make recommendations around using something like Power Apps. But unfortunately, there's no one-size-fits-all. It would flag it, and then it would be a manual process during that audit stage that we discussed, where we would need to work out what's the best replacement technology. Do we go with something like Microsoft Power Apps? Do we use Microsoft Forms? Or probably the closest like for like, maybe something like a Nintex Forms, for example. So we'll take a look at another question.
So the next one is, how long does a typical migration take from SharePoint 2013 to SharePoint 2019?
So how long is a piece of string? But typically, and I think I may sort of merge this with another question as well, what does this mean if you also wanted to, say, go to SharePoint Online? Do, previous customizations need to be updated? So whether they're done by, say, PA, or whether they're done by sort of other third parties. So when we go between multiple versions, so a basic environment, so say you're currently using the classic experience, you've used content types, you've used multiple libraries, and really just structural. So structural elements, you've maybe created web pages and used out-of-the-box web parts. That type of upgrade process can probably happen anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, including testing, building up the new environment. So from, say, SharePoint 2013 to 2019, if you've used those basic elements, we would take anywhere from, it could be 2 weeks, or it could be up to 4 weeks, including building of the environment. When we start bringing in, say, customizations that have been built, say you've already worked with PA and some customizations we've built, this is where the customizations that, assuming that you've got SharePoint, say 2013 or 2016, would have been built using what's called the classic experience. So the classic experience is still there in SharePoint 2019. It's not going anywhere. And so what that means is any customizations that have leveraged, I can obviously speak for PA customizations, they can be upgraded and basically just redeployed to SharePoint 2019. They don't need to be rebuilt. They just need to be redeployed. So typically, you could probably get away within that 2 to 4 week time period to do an upgrade. However, if you've got customizations, say, that use farm solutions, which are basically just an older way to do deployments that use .NET code rather than sort of JavaScript, those may need to be re-architected. So that may require, for a handful of web parts, an extra couple of weeks to sort of re-architect those so that they would work in SharePoint 2019. And the nice part is that these days, if you're building something for 2019, the same code can be deployed to SharePoint Online. So it's all about build once, deploy multiple locations. And this is where we leverage the classic experience. And if you go for the modern, that's obviously where it will only work in SharePoint 2019 or in SharePoint Online.
Great. There's a question about what does it mean by SharePoint 2019 for 2019. I guess you've covered that as well. So it can work seamlessly with your existing SharePoint Online environment. And if there's any customization on 2016, they can be moved across to the new version. Obviously, will need to be tested, but most customizations can be brought across. Okay, So we got 2 more minutes.
Okay, so I can talk about the question here, what are the major differences between SharePoint 2019 and SharePoint Online? So one is a little bit harder to sort of, I guess, pin down, and the reality is that all the latest features for SharePoint actually show up in SharePoint Online first. So, for example, everything that we're seeing in SharePoint 2019 now, from the modern sites and the ability to use these modern lists and libraries, they came out on SharePoint Online first. So really, from a modern feature perspective, those do come out on SharePoint Online now. At a really sort of high level, some features that are only cloud only are things like Power Apps, as well as Microsoft Flow is currently cloud only, so that you need to set up hybrid to leverage those features. But on the flip side, what SharePoint 2019 lets you do is actually have localized servers so that you can have servers at a specific site to improve performance. So those are some of the big ones.
Great. Thanks for that, Paul. So we're coming towards the end of the webinar now. We're offering all the attendees a complimentary session with Paul to go through the particular scenario. You can see the numbers to get in touch with us on screen, number, email, and website. So feel free to reach out. There's going to be a quick survey when you end the session. If you can, that will help us improve the sessions we do like this. We definitely enjoyed presenting the webinar today. Hopefully you did the same. And we look forward to seeing you at our future events. Thank you.